You think old age today is cruel. In medieval times, wrinkles were not symbols of wisdom. They were warnings, a mark that your body, and perhaps even your soul, had begun to rot. The first signs of decline, failing eyesight, trembling hands, missing teeth, were not met with care. They were whispers of weakness. Neighbors began to turn their eyes away, as if disease itself spread. Even among nobles, age carried a price. The elder, once feared as a ruler, now sat ignored, his words treated as ramblings. The feast roared on, but his voice was silence. Monasteries sometimes took in the elderly, but charity was not kindness. It meant strict obedience, long prayers, and endless cold nights. Mercy was rationed like bread, barely enough to survive, never enough to thrive. For peasants, old age meant dependence. When families could no longer feed another mouth, many were cast out. The door shut behind them, leaving the rest of life in cold exile. Aging bodies became entertainment. Children mocked their weakness, dogs barked at their steps, and adults looked away. To grow old was not a triumph. It was a slow unraveling in public view. Tremors in the hands, twitching faces, stumbling speech, signs we now call illness, were once labeled demonic. Priests declared old bodies cursed, and with the curse came suspicion, fear, and punishment. When crops failed or storms struck, the weak became scapegoats. An old man's shaking hands could condemn him as the cause of famine. Misfortune demanded a face, and the aged provided one. Religion offered little refuge. The old prayed harder, begged longer, yet salvation often slipped further away. Age was not viewed as wisdom, but as God's punishment for a lifetime of hidden sins. And for some, the nightmare came early. Old men were forced to dig graves, not for others, but for themselves. A ritual of humiliation, ensuring death arrived with no dignity. Debt was a chain many elders couldn't break. Unable to work, they were locked away in prisons. Their final years weren't lived. They were counted in darkness, one shivering breath at a time. For abandoned women, the field's edge became their bed, the night sky their roof. Some starved, others froze. Old age was not peaceful. It was exile with no return. Even courts turned against the elderly. Their memory faltered, their speech slurred, their defenses weak. Truth didn't matter. To be old was to be guilty regardless of the crime. Superstition sealed their doom. Crooked backs and toothless smiles made women appear monstrous. Villages whispered witch, and a whisper was enough to turn twilight fears into torches and ropes. Those who worked until bones gave way weren't spared. Fishermen rowed until their hands split. Farmers bent until their spines cracked. Old age was not rest. It was labor until collapse. Even family turned cold. Food was scarce and mouths many. The youngest were fed first. The old woman in the corner learned silence because hunger had stolen her voice. When misfortune struck, floods, storms, failed crops, fear demanded sacrifice. The old, already weak, became the easiest prey. Dragged through streets, condemned not for their crimes, but for their wrinkles, infirmaries offered bitter mercy. The sick lay in rows, tended by novices with little skill. The herbs soothed some, killed others. Old age here meant waiting for the candle to die. Confession was the last refuge. The elderly begged priests for absolution, fearing hellfire more than hunger. Their whispered sins vanished into silence, but their bodies carried the scars of survival. And when suspicion turned deadly, even the gallows called for elders. Some died swinging, their grey hair whipped by the storm, executed not for deeds, but for being too old to defend themselves. Hunger made thieves of the old. A scrap of bread hidden away could mean survival, but when discovered, it wasn't mercy they received, it was shame, and sometimes punishment. Winter was the final executioner. Elders who wandered too far never returned. Frost settled on their bones, and wolves did the rest. Nature showed no pity for the fragile. Some clung to duty until the end, sweeping graves, ringing bells, tending candles. Their devotion outlasted their strength, but their names, like the fading inscriptions, crumbled into dust. Growing old in medieval times was not about years gained. It was about pieces lost, strength, family, dignity. And every step down that road led closer to vanishing. Old age rarely came alone. Disease followed like a shadow. Coughs rattled halls where the elderly lay in rows, waiting. Medicine was guesswork. Survival often depended less on cure and more on luck. Infections turned small wounds into death sentences.
A scratch could fester. A toothache could poison the blood.
Families tried crude remedies, but every cough, every fever was a reminder. Death was near. When plague swept through, the old were considered already lost. Doctors came not to heal, but to separate, to contain. For many elders, the mask meant exile, not rescue. Superstition ruled medicine. A pouch of herbs, a whispered charm, a carved bone hung at the neck. These became the last shields. When they failed, so did the faith behind them, and fear often turned deadly. The frail body of an elder could be branded witchcraft itself. Wrinkles mistaken for curses, ailments mistaken for spells, the weak became the hunted. Those who lived long often lived long enough to beg. But hunger was a cruel companion. Markets overflowed with goods, yet the old were left in mud, bowls empty, eyes hollow. Service did not end with age. Even nobles' elders were made to scrub, clean, and labor until collapse. Illness was ignored so long as the floor still gleamed beneath their hands. Medicine was ritual more than science. Physicians studied flasks of urine like prophets reading stars. The patient sat shaking, knowing the doctor's words often meant more fear than comfort. Heart failure, strokes, sudden collapses. They were mysteries described as divine punishment. Families wept, but priests whispered it was judgment. Age itself became proof that heaven had begun to close its doors. When mouths were too many, some elders were left by rivers. Their rafts floated into mist, carrying not only bodies, but the shame of families who abandoned them to silence. For monks, age did not grant rest. Old scribes copied texts until eyes failed and hands quivered. Mistakes filled sacred pages, each blot of ink another toll of fading strength. Farmers worked until bodies broke. Old backs carried loads meant for youth, bones snapping under sacks of grain. When collapse came, the field did not mourn. It simply found another back. Even in homes, the old gave what little they could, weaving, mending, spinning until blood stained the threads. It was not respect they earned, but the chance to remain useful. Death often arrived at night, heralded by tolling bells. The elderly lay surrounded, but comfort was scarce. Final breaths were more about fear than peace, more about judgment than rest. Diseases that scarred the body erased dignity entirely. Leprosy marked old faces as monstrous. They were pushed into colonies, banished from towns. Their final years lived as outcasts. Even joy was denied. The tavern laughed, but not with the old. Their coins bought mockery, their presents shame. They were reminders of mortality, unwelcome guests at life's fleeting pleasures. Survival required labor, even at the edge of death. The old gathered firewood until hands split and backs snapped. If they failed, winter's teeth would finish what age began. Faith offered fear more often than comfort. Priests demanded confessions of sins, real or imagined. The old confessed until their voices broke, fearing hell more than hunger. Stocks were not just for criminals. Elders too frail to defend themselves could be chained, mocked, and spat upon. Their dignity eroded faster than their bones ever did. Some simply worked until they stopped. Sleep came quietly over parchment, candles burning low. Their lives ended not in drama, but in silence, in duty, in exhaustion. Even noble women were not spared. Once envied for beauty, they wept before mirrors that betrayed their faces. Gold couldn't hide the wrinkles, and velvet couldn't stop the creeping of time. For elders, survival often meant burying the young. Children died first from famine, disease, or war. Grief added weight heavier than years, breaking what little spirit time had left. Loneliness was sharper than hunger. Some lived out final days on bridges, halfway between village and exile, hoping for coins, fearing only the silence that always answered. And still, some begged not from men but from the sky. Their final prayers rose with crows, unanswered, scattered into twilight. Faith itself grew old and died beside them. Age brought no shield against judgment. Elders too poor or powerless were dragged before courts, accused of petty theft or sorcery, their trembling hands unable to defend against cruel tongues. Laughter cut deeper than hunger. The young mocked sagging skin, crooked teeth, failing steps. Each jeer stripped away what dignity age had left, until shame weighed heavier than bones. Confession was often punishment disguised as salvation. Elders poured out fears of sins they could barely name, only to be scolded. Forgiveness rarely came, fear remained until the grave. Children learned cruelty early. Stones replaced mercy in their games. The old, too slow to flee, endured humiliation in silence, each bruise another reminder they no longer belonged. Entertainment came at the expense of dignity. Frail servants were forced to stumble in mock dances, trembling legs treated as comedy, their collapse bringing laughter instead of compassion. Meals for the old were often scraps, the crust softened in water passed as charity. Hunger hollowed their cheeks, but pride hollowed faster when survival meant begging. Stocks humiliated the powerless. Even elders too weak to resist were locked and mocked. The public spectacle was not justice. It was entertainment paid for with broken pride. Monks aged, but duties didn't. Elders swept, prayed, copied, until bodies gave out. Silence was mistaken for obedience, when it was really exhaustion too deep to voice. Even skill couldn't save them. Weaving, spinning, sewing, once noble arts, were dismissed as worthless when crafted by wrinkled hands. Effort bought no respect, only silence in the market. Dementia was seen as possession. Elders who forgot names or muttered to themselves became objects of fear, abandoned in silence, mistaken for cursed rather than ill. Collapse was common. Too many winters ended in snowdrifts ignored by passers-by. Warmth existed, but not for those who no longer contributed. Cold was their final companion. Even among nobles, beauty defined worth. Grey hair was a curse, not a crown. Wealth could buy gowns, jewels, even feasts, but not the return of vanished youth. Faith promised comfort, but churches often grew empty. Old worshippers prayed alone, their voices lost in echo. Salvation felt far away, even inside sacred walls. Hunger forced cruel choices. Families rationed bread, leaving the oldest with least. Silence at the table spoke louder than words, their worth measured against survival. Cruelty sometimes turned deliberate. Elders accused of curses were left outside homes at night. Wolves circled, villagers ignored. The dark finished what abandonment began. Mistakes grew costly. Tired hands dropped candles, burned pages, ruined sacred texts. Age brought not wisdom, but blame. Punishment for accidents nobody could prevent. Yet even in misery, sparks of tenderness glowed. Grandmothers whispered tales to children by firelight. For a moment, wrinkles softened, and old age became memory's keeper, not just burden. Tasks no one else wanted fell to the frail. Scraping filth, cleaning streets, work beneath dignity became survival. The mockery of children made each scrape cut deeper. Even simple journeys turned dangerous. Rivers swallowed those too weak to cross. A misstep on wet stone often meant a body found downstream at dawn. Final moments often went unnoticed. Families, hardened by repetition, carried on with chores while elders gasped for breath. Death became so common, grief was rationed. Isolation marked the last years. Elders walked hills alone, banished or forgotten. The village carried on, leaving them shadows against grey skies, unmissed when they vanished. Even jesters aged. Once entertainers, they became the joke themselves, stumbling through tricks while nobles roared, not with joy, but cruelty at watching dignity collapse. Some dug graves they knew were their own. The final act of labor performed in silence, each shovelful of dirt echoing the futility of survival against time. Even surrounded by life, loneliness suffocated. Taverns rang with laughter, but the old sat unseen in corners, their silence louder than any song. Faith remained their last hope. Some crawled to churches, desperate for blessings, but villagers walked past, too busy to notice devotion carved in mud-stained knees. Even in winter's bite, survival demanded labor. Backs bent, hands bled, yet the axe fell weaker each year until wood resisted more than the body could. Markets displayed plenty, but age was invisible currency. Elders begged beside full baskets, hands swatted away, proof that abundance meant nothing if you no longer produced. Homes turned into prisons, roofs leaked, straw beds rotted, rats gnawed, and sickness lingered. Comfort was a memory. Survival reduced to waiting for dawn that brought no relief. Life did not pause for the old. While children played, elders stumbled under small bundles, each step reminding them the world had moved on without them. Cold punished the frail without mercy. Washing rags in frozen rivers left hands bleeding, yet chores continued because no one else would take on the burden. Faith became desperation. Each prayer asked not for long life, but for a gentler death. Silence answered louder than heaven, leaving fear as their truest religion.
Even warriors fell to time. Once feared knights sat powerless, swords rusting in shadows. The world remembered their strength, but forgot them long before the grave.
Charity often failed within cloisters themselves. The old went hungry while younger brothers feasted. Devotion lost beneath hierarchy, humility forced upon those with nothing left to lose. Warmth glowed just beyond reach. Taverns sang with life, yet the old froze outside doors barred not by locks but by indifference colder than the night. Even wealth couldn't buy relevance. Noble women stripped of beauty and jewels found their commands ignored, their names forgotten. Status ended not with death, but with silence. Burdens didn't lessen with age. Frail backs bent under yokes meant for youth, each bruise a reminder that survival rarely considered mercy or weakness. Age brought sickness, few dared tend. Blood on cloth, silenced rooms, families stepping back in fear. Compassion shrank when death lingered too close to touch. Storms revealed fragility. Roofs shook, winds screamed, yet only a candle stood between life and darkness. Each gust felt like death knocking on the door. Wisdom faded with trembling hands. Mistakes ruined sacred texts, each blot of ink proof that age no longer carried honor, only irritation in younger eyes. Festivals didn't lift every soul. The old sat unseen in corners, music mocking silence, joy amplifying loneliness. Celebration only sharpened the blade of abandonment. Loneliness deepened when partners died. Graves became confidants, candles the only witnesses. Words whispered to the dead filled the silence the living no longer answered. Even battlefields were searched by the frail. Scraps of metal, bones, cloth, survival stripped dignity, leaving only desperation carved into the shadows of war's remains. Hands that once created with precision now fumbled. Each stitch became a struggle, each slip a reminder that time unravels not just cloth, but the body itself. Graves weren't just for mourning, they were rehearsals. Elders sat by open earth, whispering prayers, imagining their bodies filling the void beneath flickering candles. Fog hid the path ahead, much like old age itself. Each stick gathered meant survival, but the weight pressed heavier with every uncertain step forward. Cooking for others became choking for themselves. Smoke blinded weary eyes, filling lungs already weak. Service outlived strength, but no one cared enough to stop them. Prayers slipped like beads from weak fingers. Faith remained, but fear outweighed it. Silence beyond death felt longer than any rosary chain could measure. Graveyards became mirrors. Each crumbling stone reflected what time would do to their own bodies. Rain blurred vision, but not the certainty of joining the soil soon. On the coldest nights, some fell where they walked. The world carried on, stepping around collapsed bodies as though they were already gone. Death seldom announced itself with dignity. It came in gasps, in sudden grips of the chest, while loved ones watched, powerless to stop the inevitable descent. Medicine offered little more than ritual. Herbs and prayers disguised helplessness. While the sick learned the bitter truth, healing often ended where age had already claimed victory. Children learned of mortality by watching it unfold in their homes. Straw beds became classrooms and death their first unforgettable teacher. Even nobles faced the same end. Last rites whispered over fading breaths proved that wealth gilded the coffin, but could not soften the journey into silence. Loneliness killed more quietly than disease. Many died without witnesses, huts echoing, with wind instead of prayers, their final words stolen by silence. Death drew a crowd only once, at burial. Processions through mud were reminders that dignity returned only when breath was gone, when bodies became burdens to be carried. Earth swallowed lives with ceremony. Priests chanted, "Holy water fell," but the graveyard knew the truth. Most remembered faces would soon fade like words in rain-soaked parchment. After death, arguments replaced mourning. Cloaks, bowls, and livestock mattered more than memories. Legacies shrank into objects, each one sparking disputes louder than grief itself. Flowers wilted fast, crows perched longer. The earth took without. Mercy, leaving graves to weather, names to blur, and legacies to rot into obscurity. Words offered survival beyond the grave, but most writings gathered dust unread. The silence of forgotten parchments echoed the silence of forgotten lives. Not every elder found a marked grave. Plagues and famine tossed bodies into pits, where individuality dissolved into heaps of bone and soil. In memory, souls blended with shadows. The dead weren't named, only numbered, their lives reduced to silence buried beneath endless rows of wooden crosses. Sometimes only children remembered. Rosaries passed into small hands became relics of connection, fragile links to stories already vanishing into the fog of time. Objects outlived owners. Canes leaned where hands once gripped, ivy claiming what time forgot. Memory clung to wood longer than to names. Graveyards whispered warnings. Stones cracked under storms, inscriptions faded, and thunder reminded every
visitor that the earth consumes the proud as swiftly as the forgotten.
Some believed souls lingered. Dawn mists over rooftops felt like elders watching, but the village moved on, indifferent to the unseen company. Songs kept a few alive in memory. Ballads told of sacrifice, but even they faded into background noise. Stories drowned beneath newer tales. Names carved in stone promised eternity, but moss and rain rewrote them faster than ink could. Immortality crumbled into dust with each forgotten syllable. History kept fragments, not lives. Chronicles noted deaths in passing lines, stripping faces and stories, till only cold dates survived. Humanity was lost in ink. Absence lingered longer than bodies. Empty chairs at services burned like ghosts, their silence louder than hymns. Memory sat quietly, until it too was replaced. Nature reclaimed faster than memory. Wildflowers and rabbits softened what grief abandoned. Forgotten graves became meadows, beautiful yet cruel in their indifference. Twilight swallowed graveyards whole. Crosses blurred into mist, just as names blurred from history. The nightmare of old age ended not in life, but in the silence after. In the end, time buried everything: youth, strength, even memory. The hourglass emptied, soil consumed, and the nightmare of growing old was complete, as eternal as the setting sun.